You've obviously just seen Adam Bolton, political broadcaster of enormous renown, just doing the session with Albin Kurti. We've got Iain Martin, the director of this conference, but also a columnist for The Times, long-time journalist. And, of course, we've got Deborah Haynes back, defence editor of Sky, who's just back from Ukraine, in fact, and some of you will have been in her session yesterday afternoon, which is a fab panel to talk about the UK general election. In fact, we all were lucky enough to have a sort of sneak preview yesterday from Grant Shapps and then John Healey and David Lammy of the kind of election battleground in terms of defence and foreign policy. But let's start off now where we are this morning. Adam, I mean, extraordinary decision to call it, and does that mean the result's a foregone conclusion?
Well, no, it doesn't. My sort of guideline in politics is that nothing is more or less likely than about 60-40. So, you know, things could go wrong. But as we know, no less a guru than Sir John Curtis has said that he thinks there's a 99% chance that the next government will be formed by the Labour Party. That is partly because even although the massive electoral hurdle to reverse the 2019 election would be bigger than Tony Blair scored in technical terms in 1997 just to get a one-seat majority. It does appear, if we were in a hung parliament situation, because of the unwillingness of any other party to work with the Conservatives, that whether the largest party or not the largest party in a hung parliament, Labour would also form a government. So I think everyone is preparing for a Labour-led government.
Absolutely. So, Deborah, I mean, yesterday we heard a bit from John Healey. We obviously heard from Grant Shapps. A lot of it seems to be around the 2.5% and the sort of slight difference between the strength of the Labour commitment and the Conservative commitment to that target. But how do you see the kind of defence election battleground?
Well, I think that argument is that it's so phony. Anyone inside defence knows that 2.5% by 2030 is nonsense in terms of dealing. If you're actually credibly talking about the scale of the threat, and if you genuinely want to rebuild our hollowed out armed forces, then you have to get serious immediately. That means immediately not just spending more money, but genuinely getting to grips with how that money is spent and ensuring value for money, ensuring urgency of purpose. You know, the Ukrainians have this 6-week innovation cycle. Like, you know, in the UK, it's like sort of 6 decades. I mean, it's an absolute joke. And I find it so depressing when you hear, obviously I'm an impartial journalist, but when you hear Rishi Sunak suddenly having this great awakening and realising that defence is actually important, and yet, which obviously it is, and it's really welcome that he has realised this, but then when he tries to attach this phony argument about how, oh, you know, I'm going to spend 2.5% by 2030, and look, Labour is dangerous because they're not specifically committing to something that actually he, despite his own party, ministers in his own party, like Anne-Marie Trevelyan and Tom Tugendhat, saying that the 2.5% needed to be now, he had some sort of fudge up until very recently.
And it's not built into the current spending plans either.
It's not built. There's no new money this year, but I think what's really exciting for defence followers is that for the first time in as long as I can remember, and I've been covering defence now for, you know, more than 20 years, which, you know, I've been through election cycles many times and it's never an issue. This year it feels like not only is it an issue, but it's going to have to be like pretty much the first thing that whoever is the next Prime Minister on the 5th of July has to think about, because he will be going to Washington on the 9th of July for the NATO summit, where, you know, it's probably the most important NATO summit in decades, easily, perhaps since its formation, given the threats that the alliance is facing, not just externally, but also internally, because, of course, the US election.
I think,
Iain, challenges for Labour?
Well, I just say a little about the campaign. I think Deborah's absolutely right. It is going to be an issue in the campaign, and the Tories are determined to try and force Labour onto that territory. So that's what a lot of the last kind of 10 days is about, with the benefit of hindsight, is that they identify they're 20 points behind in the polls. They can see that security is an issue, that maybe defence and the issue of trust around Labour, maybe there are some doubts there. And of course, Keir Starmer doesn't want to play on that territory. And he's not said a great deal about defence. He did a recent trip to Barrow and endorsed the nuclear deterrent, the nuclear programme. But beyond that, and a speech on Gaza, we don't know all that much really about what his instinct, his view of the world is. So the Tories, with not much to go on, and it was a really bizarre decision to announce that in the way that he did, in that sort of farce in the rain yesterday, with not much to go on, the Tories will try to play up the defence and security card. But Deborah's right, it is beyond that. It's almost a fake, bogus argument, because the reality is anyone who's involved in defence and security knows that 2.5 is not enough. If Poland is spending more than 4% already, and we'll hear later from Radek Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, and other European countries closer to the Russian threat and to the front line are really scaling up, then whoever is in power is going to have to fairly rapidly adjust to the reality, a world of really 3% and maybe even above that.
Adam.
I mean, I agree entirely with the urgency that's been expressed on this matter, but I have to say to you that both the Labour Party and a lot of political scientists away, if you like, from the defence community, simply don't think that defence and security is going to be a significant issue in the election campaign in terms of changing votes. I mean, within opinion polls, it is true that those people who consider it to be a major issue has gone up, particularly amongst Conservative voters, which I think may explain some of what Rishi Sunak did last week. But it's still at a kind of, is security a major issue? About 30% amongst Conservatives and less amongst Labour and the Democrats. Labour are pretty confident that the sort of charge that, you're a load of lefties who supported ban the bomb Corbyn, they're pretty confident that the way in which Keir Starmer has dealt with Jeremy Corbyn in person, but also the issue, is now, as far as the electorate is concerned, neutralised. That they think that, as we heard here on this stage yesterday, Labour is saying, well, we're going to spend 2.5% as well. But there's also an argument, and this is why I think this conference is very important, that the state of urgency about the global threats has simply not penetrated the wider political conversation, and it's not on voters' minds.
Yeah.
And that therefore makes it very difficult in 6 weeks for it to emerge as suddenly a big issue, unless there were to be something very, very dramatic happening in Ukraine.
I mean, I think Adam's absolutely right there, but political scientists always say defence and foreign affairs don't decide general elections, and they don't until sometimes in surprising ways that they do. I mean, 2019, in an odd way, had a foreign affairs defence component because of Corbyn. 1983 because of the Falklands War. 1992 you had the sort of flavour of the end of the Cold War and the war in Kuwait as well. So I think you're absolutely right. This time it probably won't be. I think the interesting aspect is what happens afterwards, and the challenges for Labour once they get into power, if the polls are right and they're heading for a Labour government.
Well, I've got one more on that precise theme, and then we'll open it up, because a lot of people were wondering whether Nigel Farage would enter the fray, split the Tory vote. Well, he's announced just sort of 20 minutes ago, no, he's not going to, because effectively he's saying the US election is the more important one this year, and he wants to work for a Donald Trump victory. Now, leaving aside the Farage psychodrama, there is an important point there, isn't there, that we're all under the shadow of this US presidential election that may change our security environment drastically. So what are your thoughts on that, Deborah?
Well, I mean, you really feel it in Ukraine. So the Russians have managed to exploit that huge delay, that 6-month delay in the US deciding their package of measures, which is so fundamental. I mean, it's extraordinary listening to Grant Shapps talking. It's very important, the UK contribution to the war in Ukraine, but it's the US by far in terms of volume and scale deal that is allowing the Ukrainians to stand a chance against this Russian onslaught. But the fact is that the Russians have gained ground in the east, they've just gained ground in the northeast, and the delay in the US aid to Ukraine has fundamentally damaged that relationship between Ukraine and the US, and it's really unnerved allies, and that sort of creates this sense of acute uncertainty, because everybody knows that come November it could be a very different paradigm if you do have Donald Trump again in the White House. And I think as well for the UK, it's very weird being in Ukraine where no one questions the absolute critical importance of defence because they're a country at war. We have the luxury of not being at war, but unless the political leaders are able to translate that sense of urgency to the public in a way that brings them on board for this journey that we're all, I kind of feel as though the next 5 years are not, the next government is not going to have the luxury of, let's have a nice year-long defence review, and it's not going to be business as usual as we've known in post-Cold War peacetime. It's going to change, and either the politicians get ahead of that and actually try to get us into some sort of shape, or there will be a shock and we'll have to just scramble like we usually do.
Right. The hands going up. I don't know whether we've got a two for one deal there. Are you going to?
Okay, two for one, yeah. Sophie Antrobus, but Adam, my maiden name was Sophie Gardner, so we've known each other before. I work at the Freeman Aerospace Institute at King's College London, and this is a question I sort of wanted to ask yesterday when Deborah was chairing the panel, but it's more a media question, so actually it's appropriate for now. My feeling is that one of the Ministry of Defence, or Defence's biggest problems, is its attitude to communications. Literally the most defensive profile ever. Full disclosure, I was in the Royal Air Force for 20 years. I worked in MOD Media and Comms in the mid-2000s under the Labour government then, and literally don't say anything about anything apart from maybe, oh wow, a woman's done something interesting. But other than that, and not talking about failure. So we were talking yesterday about risk, right, and taking risk and being willing to fail. I think at the heart of the problem of the Ministry of Defence, or Defence's attitude to the real security challenges it faces, is it does, on a communications level, it cannot handle failure, difficulty, challenge, risk. And I'd be really interested, with your massive experience in journalism and correspondence, on what you would say to Keir Starmer, John Healey, about really resetting that culture within defence to be much more open.
I think I'd be quite rude to them. I was going to ask that very same question, but Deborah, it comes from your session again. Is the information water table is absolutely terrible. We can talk amongst ourselves. It's not getting out there, the urgency of which you have rightly alluded to. And the other thing I thought that one of the most chilling moments, curiously, yesterday, don't read my party politics out of this, was John Healey saying we're going to spend a year having a defence review. This is utterly hopeless. Like you, actually, I've probably been through more defence reviews even than you have. And the other thing that is stalking behind this whole discussion, Iain, is demographic wintering. We are getting older. Fewer people are going into public service. We can see this. It's very difficult, as Deborah and I experience, getting young people interested to cross that threshold, to go into things like the armed forces, where you can have a brilliant career, security services and public service. Now, I find
Foxy, sorry, time is limited.
Not getting this across. What is your answer to it?
Okay, right. Deborah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's like an example of the farce. MOD hasn't actually had a full-time director of communications for about 3 or 4 years. They went, like the previous defence secretary, went through, I think, either 3 or 4 iterations of the interview process. They couldn't find the right person. And like, the fact is information is a massive weapon in a war. And obviously we're not in an active war in terms of the UK at the moment, but the MOD has this huge tool at its disposal, and yet it's not using, you've got like 77th Brigade or whatever they do. The idea that it's really unsophisticated and they're so nervous. And I think there's two reasons for it. First of all, it's like absolutely insane political control that's happened over the last 2 decades, where the MOD cannot say anything without sign-off from number 10, or they all get like really badly told off, and they don't like that. And the second thing is there's despite the denials and the puff in the press releases, anyone who's inside defence knows that it's absolutely screwed in terms of capability compared to what the politicians say we can do. And so there's huge nervousness to expose anything, because it will actually expose weakness. And I totally get that. But therefore, either stop talking tough or sort it out.
Yeah.
And then once you sort it out, then really use it as a weapon.
Sorry, Iain.
Just on the defence review point, I absolutely agree with you, Robert, but I think that what's needed, and what Labour need to understand, is that they don't have a year. It needs to be, it's not 1940, but you need a bit of that spirit of sort of Churchill and Allenbrook saying, right, you don't have months and months, you've got 2 or 3 weeks to assess what the risks and threats and full capabilities are, and then come back to me and start to plan properly. So Britain does not need to redesign its foreign policy. That is actually one of the successes of the recent period. That's down, I think, to John Bew, of course, of King's College London. There's a reset has been undertaken that should become almost bipartisan in terms of understanding the importance of the Indo-Pacific, how the world is connected, and then also knock-on effects to European security as well. So they don't need to reinvent the wheel. David Lammy doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. And on defence, I think the stuff that they'll do quickly, there are some programmes that they'll cancel, for another time to discuss which ones they might be. But beyond that, they need to get to it quickly, because there's not just the NATO summit coming. I think one of the biggest challenges that's looming for the next 5-10 years is all about tech regulation. We're going to hear about tech with William Hague shortly. And the reason why I think that matters, and I think it's underappreciated in defence, is that there's a crunch coming, which is that the future of the global economy is about to be decided in the world of AI and technological development. Now, a lot of that will be dual purpose and will be about defence technology. So when France turns up, as I'm sure President Macron will turn up for the EPC in July, saying we all need to work together more closely in Europe, which is absolutely true in terms of producing munitions, and tries to hand over a defence and security pact, it's a good thing, the Brits and the new government will have to say, hold on, where does technology fit into this? Because we heard yesterday about AUKUS, and AUKUS is really about technology and the invention of the future of the next 20, 30 years. An alternative regulatory space and way of thinking about the world being created with the Americans, then the Canadians and the Japanese, and maybe the South Koreans. So there's a crunch, because you can't be regulated by Brussels and also be part of that. So I really hope, after hearing Labour yesterday, that they're alive to the seriousness of the challenge that's facing them in about 2 months' time.
I'm going to quickly give a personal point on your question, which is, I've been engaging with the military probably for 40 years, and throughout I've been amazed by the fact that our forces, you go to Staff College or whatever, you give a talk, they're obsessed with seizing the initiative, escalation dominance, all of these other concepts as relate to military operations. They also define information operations as a major line of operations. But when anything goes wrong, so if you were to lose a warship in San Carlos Water in 1982, do you turn around and go home? Or a helicopter in Afghanistan, do you say, well, that's it now, we're finished? Whereas with information, they are so thin-skinned and fragile in their sort of... And that's been quite a long-term factor. Paul Mason, behind you, has a question, and then we'll try and get one or two more in. Time is running out.
Thank you, Mark. You'll be Paul Mason, New European. You'll be pleased to know that the new Director of Comms at the MOD is our former Newsnight colleague and ex-Buckingham Palace head honcho. So hopefully get some...
Simon Enright.
Some relief. My question is very, very brief. It's... What should the next government do at the NATO summit? Should it go, as the current government clearly signals, in with a proposal as per Cardiff to hike the floor to 2.5%, and how should it sell that if that is indeed the case?
I think that the current concern, as far as I can understand, is they're very concerned about not committing to Ukraine definitely entering the path to become members. That's a more concern to them than the level of defence spending. I think at the moment, in political terms, British governments will want to say we are the virtuous ones, rather than, in diplomatic terms, creating a further hurdle for partners who haven't yet got to the 2% point.
Although, actually, I think, hasn't Donald Trump said that it needs to be 3%? So, I mean, 2.5% is going to sound weak.
We've got a forest of hands now. Clearly, the election has energised the conference. We will try and get through a couple more, so let's try and rattle through a couple more.
Joshua Kaminski, Senior Vice President of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I asked the Shadow Secretaries yesterday about their thoughts on the future of the U.S.-UK relationship under their potential government. I wanted to ask the same question to you. How do you see the relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom evolving, potentially where you have a situation with Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and President Donald Trump?
Iain?
Well, I mean, you mentioned there, the hot news that Nigel Farage is not going to stand, which probably saves actually the Tories about 30 seats. Actually, it's probably the best thing that's happened to the Tories in the last 24 hours after the disastrous performance.
I would just observe, I think Nigel Farage is much more interested in the Tory party than he is in reform.
Potentially, but he's also, if the rumours are correct, okay, it's an outlandish rumour, the idea that Donald Trump wants to make Nigel Farage his ambassador to London. But I think there are probably some Republican donors who've paid a lot of money who'd be a bit concerned about that and might expect the job instead. But he has talked about being an emissary on behalf of Trump. I mean, I think the relationship in defence and security terms, obviously incredibly close, and getting closer, thanks to the AUKUS partnership, which I know I sound like an AUKUS obsessive, but I just think it is. I think it's absolutely transformative, and we don't focus on it enough in this country. But it's going to be really tough if it's Sunak, which is very unlikely to be. But if it's Starmer versus Trump, or with having to deal with Trump, I would love to be a fly on the wall for those first for those first conversations. But Starmer's a lawyer, and David Lammy has already spoken about his emerging friendship with J.D. Vance, and it's politics. So they'll probably astonish the Labour left and be much friendlier than you think.
I think surely it also needs to be about capability. You really see, I've seen over the last sort of decade, there's been a weakening in the relationship. Obviously, everyone talks about how strong it is, and clearly there are close bonds between individuals. But in terms of the UK actual capability militarily, which has earned that respect over time, unless we sort that out, then I think it's going to become increasingly tested.
That's another reason to spend more.
I think that above and beyond, I think the British government, whoever it is, certainly under Keir Starmer, will do all it can to be as close as possible to the United States. I don't think that will change in any way. I think the concern is rather the other way, as to whether there is a withdrawal of the United States from global involvement, and that will, I think, be in parallel with things that Ian's talking about, the development of a European defence pillar within NATO, and frankly what attitude the next administration takes towards that.
Time for one or two more, and we have a former Chief of Defence Staff, so should definitely get a question in.
Thank you. It's not like you, and I sympathise, by the way, about the media, but don't forget that what we were doing on operations was very much, certainly in my case, in my own gift, back here, completely different, run by bureaucrats and politicians, and the military, whose instinct is to be helpful, is usually stifled. But I'd like to pick Iain up on a point. You said, if you like, our grand strategy is fine. John Bew's done his stuff. It doesn't need examining. I can't agree with that. For me, a grand strategy or any form of strategy that is undeliverable is not worth having. And I would argue that this government has fallen into the trap of thinking it's something like we were as a country in the 19th century, maybe in the interwar period. It's undeliverable without a huge amount of extra resource. And one particular whinge I had is to do with Ukraine. We are encouraging Ukrainians to fight and die on our behalf with almost certain knowledge not going to win. I'd say that is immoral and poor strategy. And so I'd start with Ukraine. If it isn't going to work, find another strategy, or seek some sort of resolution through negotiation. So that fundamental disagreement here is where I think the next government's got to go. Either resource it or do it differently.
I would say that where I would push back on that is the BU strategy, which has been through 3 prime ministers. I think that's an extraordinary thing to survive the madness of British politics in the last 5 years. To deliver a strategy which I think, grand strategy, which I think is correct, but it's acknowledged that the money is not enough, and you're absolutely right. It's got to 2.5%, but I just think everyone's kidding themselves. To deliver that, or even if it's a slightly different version of the strategy, need to get to 3 at least. I mean, this is just the reality. There is a conversation that needs to happen directly with the British public. We are in a different world. We are in a war era. This is not just a short-term blip. This is the story of the next 10, 20, 30 years. We need to think differently about national resilience, security, defence. We shouldn't be alarmist or hysterical about it. It's going to be a very long haul. But this is really the democracies really properly up against it, against the autocratic powers, and we need to get our act together quickly.
Can I just say on Ukraine, I mean, you sort of say that Ukraine's not going to win. Like, how can you possibly know that? Ukraine has the ability to win if it has the support. And I think that's the thing that's so frustrating. There's like incredible ingenuity happening on the ground that, we can't talk about, rightly so. But I interviewed David Cameron, who sadly isn't here today, or I'd have asked him again, 3 weeks ago when he was in Lviv on his way out. And he kind of proudly talked about the work that they're doing to you had like Rishi Sunak saying in April that he's putting the defence industry on a war footing. Really? Like, I can't see any evidence of that. And David Cameron was sort of like really pushing, yes, this is a real thing. Actually, do you know what? We are appointing a Prime Minister's envoy to ramp up defence production. Has that happened? No, it completely has not happened. It's fallen by the wayside. It does not at all demonstrate any sense of urgency. And so you're right, they won't win unless the West have the... But you sort of you said it a bit more strongly that they're not going to win, and they can win if the West. I mean, what does win look like? I mean, you talk about there needs to be a just peace, but that's a whole different issue. But the point being, how can you have the UK talking about the need to the massive urgency to expand defence production, and then it just not happen? It's a travesty.
Right, we are perilously near the edge, but I'm going to shamelessly break the time limit. So let's take the 4 questions of people who have their hands up. We'll take all those questions and then we'll chuck them out to the panel. I know you said this is an old Tony Blair trick, Adam. Yeah. But, let's take the questions one by one and then we'll try and get some responses from the panel and we'll go a minute or 2 over time.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Andrew Adamson from King's College London. We've talked a lot about how the media have reported and had difficulties with perhaps the MOD information machine. I'm just wondering the degree to which you think that the media can shape the narrative and the landscape that you're portraying here. There's a reporting responsibility, I understand that, but I wonder if there needs to be a shaping of the editorial perspective on how you can shape a balanced and critical debate on this requirement. So in other words, rather than just being reactive, being proactive. Thank you.
Okay, next question, just behind you. Yeah. So.
Hi, I'm Tara Zamet. I'm a PhD candidate in war studies at King's. And my question is, Professor McMillan said yesterday that trust in kind of institutions and politicians and media and stuff is kind of gone and we just trust history. And I'm just wondering, as some of the country's kind of big voices on foreign policy and defense, what do you think could be done to strengthen public trust in what the media has to say about the kind of urgency that you've mentioned?
Okay.
Thank you, Richard Hart from the Army. We had Deborah's shadow factories yesterday. We had Lord Peach's sheds full of stuff. we've flirted around ideas of total defence, and that's more than just a few more water bottles in the attic. So the question is, if we do have to go for that and the cost is large, is the public ready for it? And will they tolerate cuts to health and education to fund an enhanced defence budget?
And then there was one last... Oh, yes, you've already got a mic, yeah.
Stephen Ahart from the University of Texas at Austin, an undergraduate in international security. I'm interested in how Labour can deliver on defence and communicate defence to their voters, given the different priorities that y'all have already stated, such as funding the NHS, the cost of living, and even if defence is so important, how can they communicate this if it seems that Tory voters are the only ones who care about defence in this election cycle?
Great. Well, quite similar themes there, actually, about the shaping the climate of public debate, media role in this, media responsibility, or are we guys just out of trust and patience in terms of the wider public? Did you want to lead off, Deborah? And then let's have a word from all of the panel on this, and then we'll wind up.
So you can follow our Prepared for War ? Series on Sky News, where I'm trying to do exactly that, trying to make defence accessible and bring people in that maybe, like our generation, people, like I'm 47, so I've lived through, I've enjoyed the sort of the peace dividend, and people of my generation and younger they don't have to think about defence because it hasn't been a burning issue really in their lifetimes. And so to try to, like I've had the privilege to cover war, that's wrong, sounds a bit weird, but I've seen what insecurity means and how it feels and how literally health, everything, nothing matters if you haven't got security. And so is there a way to try to bring to life how important it is, and not to like bash our country, but to be a critical friend and point the direction of why it's important and then what needs to happen. So we are trying.
I think there has been a certain mindset in the media, perhaps in the sort of the period of security that we turned out to enjoy in the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, of kind of war is hell, defence is about war is about killing people, that's a bad thing. And I think that attitude is still pervasive in some parts of the media. I would say, and I'm no longer part of the company, it is not part of the coverage which we've seen on Sky News of a lot of those things. But this is not really about individual bits of competition. I was at another meeting of political scientists talking about the election last night, and I was making a point which I'd also heard, incidentally, Trevor Kavanagh, the columnist of The Sun, making, where basically he was at a political discussion and he sort of lost his temper and said, look, this is all rubbish. We have to look at the level of danger out in the world, the need for the sort of rearmament we've been talking about, and that the political debate he thinks is going to be largely irrelevant in the coming years. Now, the response when I put this to the assembled political scientists was, well, if the politicians think that, they've got to make the case to the people. It's not us to make that. So I think the question is, if we believe, and I think most of us do, are concerned about the level of danger in society, are there politicians who are going to embrace that? And I would actually argue in an odd sort of way that Labour in its current sort of patriotic mode is possibly more likely to make that than a Conservative Party which is going down a very fiscally conservative route.
Iain, last word.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. That sense of sort of the Labour Party of, if it's the Labour Party of Healey, Bevan, of that sort of post 1945 Labour Party, well, maybe they have a shot. I think ultimately it's about the directness of the conversation. And I think that the public, I think people are not stupid. And I think that if it is explained to people calmly, non-hysterically, reasonably, that this is the challenge, I do think people will listen to that message. And I do think, as has happened many times in history, people will be prepared to make the sacrifice ultimately.
Right, I'd love to thank the panel and say to you it's 10:30 back here for Lord Haig's panel, Full Spectrum Emerging Technologies, which we're all looking forward to. So we've slightly curtailed coffee time, but let's thank the panel and see you back at 10:30.